Hello and welcome back to the world of Spirit and Shield. My name is John and I will be your guide throughout this journey. For those of you joining us for the first time, Spirit and Shield is a brand new fantasy world that we will be exploring through short stories. Every now and then I'll release additional content, such as pictures, maps, drawings, and some other odds and ends that will give you more insight into this world. So stay tuned for those. Today though, we have our first short story. It's called The Waker of Waves. It takes place in a place called Cambria. Before we jump into that though, I would like to ask your support on Patreon and to follow me through social media. Links are down below. I'm not going to dwell on it too much. Basically, if you like what you see, would like to see more, please consider supporting me. That would help me to continue to do what I'm doing and to do more of it. So I'd be able to release more stories, more additional content, and maybe make it look a little bit more professional as well. So again, if you enjoy it, support it. Links are down below. Let's go and get started with our first short story. So go and get comfy, grab a beanbag chair, or I don't know if anyone has those anymore, but yeah, so go and get comfy, and here we go. The Waker of Waves. The sun sat high, and there were naught but wisps of clouds to contend with its pure clear light. A warm day, perfectly balanced with a cool breeze, yet not a soul was to be seen outside. The fishing boats sat empty at their moorings. The crabs, lobsters, and prawns sat uncollected in their traps, patiently awaiting their inevitable fate. And the inhabitants of this once bustling coastal city sat silently imprisoned in their homes. Among the imprisoned were weathered old fishermen with their weathered old wives, wise merchants and fool merchants, youthful maidens dreaming of crossing the sea, and young lads dreaming of youthful maidens. One of these inhabitants sat out on the balcony of a 7-story palace. Its bone-white limestone walls climbed up from the water's edge and towered over both silent city and stirring sea. With a certain bored agitation, the young Cambrian princess raised a crystal glass to her lips. After emptying it, she grabbed the bottle next to her. When that too had been emptied, she tossed it over the balcony, indifferent to the cruel fate it met on the cobblestone road below. A servant promptly brought another, while the princess's cerulean eyes stared down the ocean from under black brows. She sat and saw everything from her perch. Saw everything, but felt nothing. After all, that was the point of the wine. It was also the wine, however, that brought back the memory, a memory of peaches and salt. Of her only love, who at that very moment was betraying her several stories below. Even in her altered state, Fialina, the 16-year-old princess of Cambria, could clearly recall every detail of their meeting. The wine brought forth images of a dewy meadow interspersed with lavender and long soft grasses that brushed her legs as she moved through them to get to him. He brushed his dark hair from his forehead, all the while watching the sparrow-sized sea dragons bob and glide on the breeze, their iridescent feathers glistening in the sunlight. The princess remembered the dragons. Kelekona. She remembered the name for them that he had taught her from the old Alanekian tongue. There were no Kelekoni in Cambria. In the Alanekian Isles, though, there were plenty, and she was instantly charmed by their aerial antics. Fialina had come to Alanekia with her parents, who had come for a gathering of the island chieftains. The shipping season would be ending soon, as the fall and winter storms would make seafaring too dangerous. Costly wars on the mainland had led to a decrease in trade, and as the islands survived largely on trade with the mainland, they were looking at a very lean winter. From Cambria, from Danakia, from Zalanhar, and all the others, they had come to ask the aid of the Alanekians, who were the only ones known to successfully weave the weather. The art of weather weaving was both art and science, for there would often be unexpected secondary or even tertiary or quaternary effects from tampering with such a temperamental thing as the weather. A storm, for example, could successfully be held back for some time, but the buildup of pressure could eventually result in even greater storms. In fact, it was precisely for this reason that the Allenechians refused to interfere further to extend the shipping season. They had been redirecting, dissipating, and holding back minor storms throughout the summer, but the natural balance now needed to be restored. Typically, this was done during the colder months, when many ports were frozen anyway. The weather weavers warned that without a release, the resultant storms would be catastrophic. The meetings would last for 2 weeks, and although all eyes and ears were focused on the outcome, there were other events in play that would have more far-reaching impact. While the chieftains, their wives, and advisors were busy with their ceremonies and politics and economics, Fialina, the dark-haired princess and daughter of the chieftain of Cambria, was busy elsewhere. Each day of her stay in Allanechia, she walked to the market and bartered a handful of berries to enjoy while she wandered around and explored the island. It was, after all, her first time in Allanechia. Next to the berry stall was a young fish merchant of about 16 or 17 years of age. Each day, as she passed by his stall, he called out to her, "Alin Hana," meaning dark maiden, "a special offer for you, a fish for a kiss." And each day Fialina would respond sternly, saying, "Kurilsa," or fish boy, not referring to the young man's trade, but rather comparing his strength and demeanor to that of a fish. "Kurilsa, but I don't want a fish." "But you do want a kiss." His sly response and boyish grin infuriated the girl, who could not believe he had the audacity to claim to know what she wanted. Each day she would turn away without a word and go for her walk about the island, all the while contemplating the boy's words, his boyish grin and emerald eyes, and what she wanted. The first week of her stay in Allanechia passed this way. The meetings seemed to be going nowhere, but going nowhere with great ceremony, and Fialina continued to spurn the advances of the self-assured, though seemingly innocent, fish boy. Then, on the last day of the week, Fialina bartered for her handful of berries as usual, this time some sweet reddish purple berries, with a horribly bitter aftertaste. She found her eyes searching for some familiar company, and her ears waited with bated breath to hear the Ilin Hana they had come to expect. It didn't come. No emerald gaze met hers, and no call echoed in her ears. The fish boy was not there. Fialina walked on in silence, every now and then putting a berry in her mouth, only to wince at the incredibly unpleasant aftertaste. She walked down to the pier. Unlike the wooden piers at the Cambrian docks, these ones were made of rough-hewn stone, with the end of the pier sloping into and disappearing under the water. She was struck by the immense size of it. It was easily large enough for 4 draft horses to walk side by side. In fact, this was often done. When the Allenechians would slay one of the great leviathans of the deep, they would not carve the carcass up in open water. Given the unpredictability of the sea and the ferocity of its many denizens, it was seen as infinitely wiser to tow the carcass back to the safety of the shore first. If a sea serpent, or nishagdu, grabbed the carcass, it was simply cut loose, and both vessel and crew remained intact. If the carcass survived the journey back to shore, a team of horses would pull it across the stone pier and onto dry land, where many skilled hands with sharp knives and axes awaited it. The process had been repeated so many times that the pier stones were worn smooth. Fialina looked around. There weren't many people on the pier that day. A couple older fishermen were sitting together, lines in the water, casting tales of their younger days. A woman was gathering crabs from traps and putting them in a reed basket hanging from her arm. As Fialna was watching all of this, she popped a berry into her mouth and grimaced as the aftertaste hit her. "You're supposed to spit it out," a voice broke in. Fialna looked up to meet it. She hesitated. Unexpectedly captured by those deep green eyes, she could not escape. She stared back into them, and all the world faded into a sea of green, and she knew what she wanted. "What?" she finally managed to get out. "Those are Mari berries. I guess they don't grow on your island," he laughed. "No one here actually eats them." "You don't eat them?" She looked a little concerned. "No. You peel the skin off and suck on it. When the flavor's gone, you spit," he said as he took a berry from her hand and demonstrated the proper technique. "The bitterness is in the middle." "But why not just eat different berries then?" she asked. "Why did you keep eating them even though they tasted so bitter at the end? The first taste is worth it, right?" "I suppose. Still," she said, "it seems like a waste." He looked up at the sky. "What's a waste, spending such a fine day standing around talking about berries? Would you like a tour of the main island?" "You're not too busy? With your fish?" she added a little awkwardly. "They can wait," he shrugged. "Besides, you can help me with that later." A little concerned he might not be joking, Fialna nonetheless followed him. First, she followed him down the old stone pier, where they watched some black and white birds with long beaks and longer legs hunt the shoreline for mussels. Then she followed him through the market where they'd met every other day before. Today, though, it seemed somehow different. The islanders continued with their daily tasks, with all the meandering and lazy gossiping characteristic of such small coastal towns. But it was different. It seemed at once more lively and joyful, yet with a relaxed calm like children on a summer day. They continued, through a farming village with more fowl than people, to a forest where songbirds flitted about and red-tufted squirrels chattered at them incessantly from the white oaks. They followed a clear stream that trickled and flowed, then gushed and roared as it met the ocean, head-on in a noisy and endless debate. By now they were walking side by side, and their path led them to a small grassy plateau overlooking the ocean. Two jagged rows of standing stones stood on the edge of the plateau. The stones, each almost 3 meters tall, were worn smooth by wind and water. In the now fading light of day, they cast long shadows upon the grass. The pair walked silently, passing through twilight and shade. Still warm air surrounded them. Fialna felt it, and it spread and grew as they neared the coast. She glanced at the boy's face. His serene, boyish expression remained, but his eyes were lit with a wildness that made her uneasy. He took her by the hand and led her to the edge of the plateau, and down a series of rough stones that served as a stairway down to the water. A small wooden boat with oars danced lightly up and down. The fish boy hopped deftly into it and reached out his hand. "Elin Hana, a fish for a kiss?" he called out. Fialna smiled. "But you don't have any fish, Curiosa," she replied as she steadied herself with his hand and climbed into the boat. "It's a wager," the boy grinned, a pure boyish grin. "And you can call me Daniel, if you'd like." "Well, Daniel, it will be dark soon, and the fish will not even see your bait." She smiled, then quickly added, "And you can call me Fialna." "Then you agree to our wager, Fialna?" Daniel said. "Fine," she responded, raising her nose slightly, "but you won't catch anything." As they rowed away from shore, Fialna noticed that the standing stones, back on the shore, were not entirely smooth, but had faces carved into them on the side facing the sea. Some were bearded, others were plain, and still others seemed to depict the faces of women. Their eyes and expressions, though, were all the same, silent, calm, and unyielding. These seeking stones kept watch over the pair, while a small herd of Elahias swam just offshore. their tails sweeping back and forth behind them. Every now and then they dove to graze on the sea grasses. One of the Elahia's stags turned his nose up, letting his antlers dip into the water, and let out a whinnying bellow that echoed across the sea. The whole scene was so serene. Yet Fialina felt a growing terror within her. It started off as naught but a breeze to her soul, but it grew the more they drew away from the shore. It was now a tempest beating in her chest, restricting her heart and tearing at her lungs. She turned her eyes on Danir, who was silently dipping his oar into the water. The wild look had returned to his eyes. He stared out at the water, but seemed to be looking beyond it. The boat dipped. Fialina tried to focus on anything else. The sky, the sunset, the sea. The shore, the stones, the sea. The stag, the sea. The depths, the sea. The sea, the sea. She felt it closing in. The salt, the spray, the sea. Then suddenly, it stopped, and she found herself staring into his calm eyes once again. Her heart still pounding, she tried to compose herself. The serenity in his eyes said, "Everything's fine, trust me." And she did. It was about an hour later that the pair started heading back to the shore. The seeking stones now stood in moon and starlight. After Danir tied the boat off, they ascended the stairs up to the plateau. For a moment, they stopped, nervously avoiding each other's furtive glances. Danir pushed the loose locks on his forehead back, sighed, and finally said, "Well, I guess you were right. They just weren't biting tonight. So, Linhana, I have no fish for you. But Curiosa, I do not want a fish," Fialina almost whispered as she leaned toward him. She bathed in the emerald pools of his eyes until they closed and their lips met. Their infatuation, now mutual, continued through the next and final week of meetings. They would meet early in the day, usually near Danir's fish stall. Sometimes they would go for walks through the soft meadows, charming forests, and rolling hills of the main island. Other times they would go out on the boat, or just sit on the shore and stare at the ocean. Or more accurately, Danir would stare at the ocean, and Fialina would stare at Danir, watching the light on the water reflect in his eyes. Still other days they would go nowhere, and simply sit at Danir's fish stall, where they would try to concoct clever ways to get passers-by to barter for their fish. The days were long and full, but the week was short. They agreed to meet early on their final day together, in a clearing in the forest they had explored the day before. The clearing was very secluded. Even the clouds that day did not venture to spy on the couple, and the sun just shined on approvingly. Their only company were the Kalikona that bobbed and dove in the breezes, whistling low, then increasing sharply in pitch as they bobbed up. Fialina walked through the meadow, the long soft grasses brushing against her legs as she moved. And there he was, standing by a peach tree, running his hand through his hair. They spent the morning in that meadow, until a suspiciously sudden downpour caused them to take shelter in the nearby wood. Danir had conveniently brought an oiled sealskin pack that the rain rolled right off of. Once in the safety of the trees, he revealed its contents: a bottle of salt wine, 2 large seashells carefully wrapped in linen, and several peaches so ripe that Fialina smelled them before she saw them. In the dim light, they sipped wine from the shells, ate peaches, and listened to the rain tap the trees' broad leaves with a rhythm all their own. Even in this seclusion, however, the question of tomorrow remained with them. Fialina spoke first. "I leave tomorrow with my parents. Will you write to me?" After an artful pause, Danir replied, "No, I don't think I will." After he had seen the effect this had on the poor girl, he continued, "I mean, I'm not very good at writing. But if you're not opposed, perhaps I could come see you in Cambria." Her eyes widened. "I've looked up a merchant ship departing in a week," he continued. "We'll sail to Dyrnekia first, and then to the Cambrian port. The whole journey should be over by the next new moon." Without a word, Fialna threw her arms around him, and it was settled. And so it was that the meetings in Allenekia came to an end. With the aid of precious gems and promises of several shipments of grain, the weather weavers reluctantly agreed to extend the shipping season, while the young couple made plans to meet again on Cambrian shores. All around there was an atmosphere of celebration. Back in Cambria, Fialna began what seemed to her like an unending watch for a ship named the Wealthy Widow. She stayed busy as much as she could, tending the palace gardens, riding through the city's narrow, winding streets, and eagerly taking on any small task that was needed. Wherever she was, whatever she was doing, Fialna kept the memories of her time in Allenekia close to her heart. She saw him with his boyish grin. She could smell the peaches and feel the strength and tenderness of his hand in hers. She created new memories for them as well. Visions of their life together in Cambria filled her with joy and kept her longing at bay. Their reunion at the pier, their courtship, their binding ceremony, and their lives together afterwards. She saw it all in wonderful detail. She would glance at the seaward horizon and smile, knowing that it would bring her love to her in only a matter of days. Ship horns sounded loud, long, and often. The creaking of masts and yelling of orders followed the arrival of each new ship into the port. In the autumn months, ships began returning to port to stay and rest their weary hulls until after winter's thaw. Seagulls screeched in the wind, and children screeched below in the foamy surf as they hunted for crabs and seashells in the tide pools. At every horn blow, Fialna ran to the balcony of the 7-story limestone palace and squinted in the sunlight, trying to spot the distinct green and pink pattern of the flag flown by the Wealthy Widow. Around evening one day, Fialna found herself lost in thought, pruning some of the palace's berry bushes. She held the branches, studying the berries that hung delicately from them. She took one, peeled the skin off, and began to suck on it. She smiled. A horn blew suddenly in the distance. It caught her off guard. As she was on the ground floor anyway, she decided just to go to the pier instead of climbing the 7 stories to try to identify the ship. As she drew closer to the harbor, she could see it pulling slowly into dock. But this ship had no mast, and it flew no colors. She drew closer, trying to figure out what kind of ship that large could sail with no mast. The closer she got, the more she understood. The ship had had a mast. Only the bottom half remained now, with the remnants of spectral sails clinging loosely to the ropes. Fialna caught sight of a tattered flag hanging limply over the side of the ship. The pattern was unmistakable. Her stomach dropped. Her head throbbed and chest tightened. She watched through dry eyes as the crew, white with salt and staring through hollowed, sleepless eyes, climbed onto the pier. There were men. There were boys. Not nearly enough to crew the ship. Watching for an eternity, she scanned their eyes and faces. Too tall, too old, red hair, wrong eyes, bearded, bald. He was not there. He was not there. He was... The realization hit her like a blow. The men moving around her, the townspeople, the blue sky, everything swirled and went to black. Fialna awoke in her bed a couple hours later. She sat and stared, watching the bright light of day wither and die. But night brought her no rest. How could he not be there? He was right there the whole month she'd been waiting. She saw him in the garden with her. They rode through the streets together. They had children together. He was right there. She could see his eyes, feel his living, breathing spirit. But now suddenly, he was gone. Visions of their future faded to a world of fiction. What little sleep Fialna got that night was tormented by visions of her Danir, surrounded by massive waves beating down on him, pulling him beneath the heaving sea. The sea. She recalled her experience on the boat with him. The sea, the power, the terror she felt returned, and the wild look in his eyes. But they were gone now. Only the sea remained. The sea. She went on like this for almost a week, seeing no one, going nowhere, and barely existing. Her parents did what they could to console her, but they could not bring her back, any more than they could bring him back. Then one day, the princess awoke to a sharp tap-tap on her window. It was still early morning, and most everyone was still asleep, so the sudden tapping drew her rapidly from her nightmares. A painted raven sat on her windowsill, pecking impatiently at the glass. Fialna cautiously got up and opened it. The raven hopped inside and raised its shiny head, revealing a small scroll attached to a harness under its chin. After removing the scroll, Fialna took a coin from the table beside the window and attached it to the raven's harness. It abruptly hopped back up to the window and set off to trade the coin for its reward and to receive its next assignment. With trembling hands, she unrolled the scroll. It was from him. The rough pen strokes told a story of storms and monsters of the deep, of a valiant crew and a desperate struggle, of a broken ship and the open sea, of wind, of waves, of salt and spray, of death and survival. Finally, the letter told of love and hope. By now, the scroll was wet with tears and the ink was smudged. She read it again and again, and just like that, her beloved re-entered her mind, but no longer as a corpse. He was back as a hope and as her future. The letter was dated from a week before, sent from one of the lesser islands of Danekia. While many people preferred ravens because of their intelligence and reliability, they weren't the fastest of messenger birds. That meant he could arrive any day now. With new life and energy, Fialna began preparing for his arrival. Any day, as it turned out, was the next day, shortly before midday. The moment Danir stepped onto that pier, Fialna threw her arms around him, and the two were hardly apart afterwards. One by one, Fialna's visions of their future together became real, passing into the present and then fading into cherished memories. The relief that Fialna felt at having Danir back with her, however, would be only temporary. Less than a month after their reunion, Fialna woke before the sun to find him missing. She left the room quietly, trying not to wake the others. She went to the pantry, but found only the cook picking through some eggs. She went to the bathhouse, but it was empty. She called for him in the aviary, but was answered only by the annoyed cackling of the messenger ravens, jays, and magpies. As Fialna was leaving the cacophony she created, she almost ran over Irarit, the Apterian falconer who was just entering. The suddenness of the near collision startled him, causing his feathers to stand on end as he let out a startled, ear-piercing screech. Recovering from the encounter, they both straightened themselves up and gave each other a short bow. The Apterian then turned his great avian head towards the messenger birds, and with one word, or perhaps several, Fialna never could understand the strange, harsh tongue of the Apteri. He silenced them. Then he turned his head sharply towards Fialna. She shuddered involuntarily under the interrogating gaze of his inhuman eyes. "I was just," she stammered, "looking for Danir. Have you seen him?" The Apteri of old did not disgrace themselves by speaking other languages that they considered inferior, so the falconer responded by pointing a talon towards the port. Fialna gave a shallow bow, which was returned in kind and left quickly in that direction. She walked down the cobblestone path, the seabirds' harsh cries grating on her ears. The smell of the salt water, more pungent with every step, made her stomach roll, and she struggled to keep from vomiting. The first light of day began to show, and as she reached the top of the path, overlooking the port, she stopped. Before her lay the immense, immeasurable, sinking, rising, breathing, heaving, crushing, killing sea, and in the middle was a small fishing boat. Vivid memories of pain and searing emptiness came back and swam before her eyes. Gathering what strength she could, she pushed on towards the shoreline. She watched in horror as the delicate boat was tossed about. She screamed and waved frantically until finally he saw her. Danir paddled back to shore, surprised to see her. Once safely on land, Fialna wrapped her arms around him like a python. "What's the matter?" he asked quickly, shocked by the look of horror on her face and the trembling in her body. The first few words were incomprehensible, but after a few attempts, Fialna was finally able to get out why and what are you doing. "I was catching some fish to go with breakfast," Danir replied softly, not taking his eyes off her. "I thought I can't. Please don't go out again. Please." Her cerulean eyes drizzled as she struggled desperately with the words. Danir pulled her closer and felt her body convulsing. "Okay," he whispered. "I won't go." Behind him, he could hear the hush of soft waves rolling and could feel a caressing breeze on his neck. Every 2 weeks, the influential women of Cambria would come together for a meeting of sorts. The men assumed its purpose was to make garments and blankets, for they did in fact do this as they talked. The men, being men and therefore taking most things at surface value, assumed that was all. The women who were not invited to participate assumed the meetings were a venue for the most horrendous gossip, presumably about themselves. And the less attractive women, both in appearance and otherwise, took it a step further and were convinced the group was involved in some kind of unnatural dark magic. The banal truth, however, was that the ladies sincerely enjoyed each other's company, and the making of garments was simply to give a more solid reason for the meeting. It was while Fialna was at one of these meetings that Danir first broke his promise. It was a promise he never could have kept, but at first he tried. He avoided the sea and tried to occupy himself with work around the palace grounds. There was always plenty to do, but the work was mindless and dull, and the sea was too near, its beckoning too strong. Whenever Fialna left for one of the gatherings with her mother, Danir would go to the pier, borrow a boat, and go out. Or he would just dive right in, letting the water rush all around him. He was always discreet about this affair and took pains to cover his tracks, not because he thought it was improper or out of fear, but because he remembered the terror in her eyes that morning on the shore. But he was gravely mistaken about how Fialna would react if she found out. Danir was just returning to the palace from one of his clandestine swims. He had already changed his clothes and dried his hair and was hurrying back to the palace to wash up before dinner. As he was climbing the limestone steps from the courtyard, a voice called out, "Kurilsa!" No other voice could sound so sweet. He turned, and there she was, a joyful warmth radiating across her face, and those eyes. She embraced him, leaned in, and pressed her lips against his. She stopped, not letting go of him. She wet her lips. The taste of salt water on them was distinct and jarring. Her brows darkened. Danir realized his mistake, but it was too late. "Fia, I'm sorry, I just can't help it," he said quietly. Her gaze bore into him, her eyes pleading and with the primal desperation of an animal caught in a trap. In a way, she believed him. and that was the problem. Her fingers clutched him tightly. A shadow fell over her face. And those eyes. He awoke suddenly. They grabbed him. He yelled. They gagged him. He thrashed. They punched. He kicked. They bound. He struggled. They bludgeoned. He saw black. With effort, he opened his eyes. A chair. A table. A pastel blue wall. A large cushion on the floor, wine red with gold trim. A neat stack of clothes on the table. A silver plate of delicacies lying next to it. Then, heavy footsteps in the hallway. The door unlocked and opened, and there she was, with an odd look of stern pity on her face. 2 palace guards followed her into the room. After a prolonged and heavy silence, she spoke. "I love you," she said, "and I will not lose you again." She walked over and kissed his lips, but they did not move. He just stared at her until she left. She came to his room every day at first, but she never stayed long. It pained her greatly to imprison her love, but she knew she had no choice. She had paid some witnesses to connect him with the murder of a local commoner, so her parents had ordered his arrest. As the witnesses claimed he was drunk and therefore not in control of himself, a life sentence was the most he would receive. Fialina made sure he was given every luxury possible. So Danir sat in his luxurious prison, food and wine brought to him daily. More than a couple times he rushed the door when it opened, only to be beat back into the room by the guards. The walls and floor were stone of the finest quality and craftsmanship. There was no escaping. Danir began refusing to see Fialina, but she came anyway, so he blocked the door with everything he had in his cell, and refused to open it even for food and drink. His fast drew him deeper into delirium, and he began to hear it again. The seabirds crying in the salt wind, the waves swelling up and melting away, the foam and the spray. He could hear the sea calling to him from its very depths. And one day, he called back. And there she sat, on the balcony of the 7-story limestone palace. She sat and stared down the sea. On the horizon, a behemoth was rising. Water poured down its massive sides and ran down its rows of long ivory tusks as it reared up, higher and higher, eclipsing both sun and sky. This was Vakros, waker of waves and lord of the deep. In the shadow of the beast the city sat silent. The weathered old fishermen huddled in their houses with their weathered old wives. Wise merchants and fool merchants both sought refuge in the temple, and youthful maidens sat together with young lads and tried to think of anything but the sea. The young Cambrian princess sat on her balcony, the taste of salt and peaches fresh on her lips, and saw everything. The blanket of slate clouds that covered the sky, the boats at their moorings, empty and dancing up and down on quickening waves, the desolation of a city once full of joy and laughter. But she did not feel the cold rain as it beat down on Cambria, nor did she feel the salt wind lashing against her skin. She looked into the eyes of the ocean, and it looked back. The behemoth, now at full height, dove with tremendous force, sending forth a tidal wave. It gushed forward, rolling, crushing, drowning the ancient city of Cambria, and the boats at their moorings, the crabs in their traps, the men and women in their homes, an imprisoned young fish merchant, and even the Cambrian princess were gone. Only the sea remained. The sea. So that is the end of our first short story, The Waker of Waves. I hope you enjoyed it. Each story will have its own flavor, so if you didn't necessarily like this one or like how it ended, don't worry. I'm not not gonna go like Game of Thrones and like kill all the characters and everything. So hang in there. There will be happier endings to other stories. Um, so with that, again, if you liked it, please support me on Patreon. Link is down below. For $5 a month, you will get access to the downloadable PDF files of these stories. So you can take this with you and read it, wherever, whenever you would like, and you can share it with friends as well. So if you had any questions or comments about this story, please share them down below or on any of my social media. And next week, we will actually be discussing those. So any questions you had, we're going to talk about next week in a video. And any comments, I'll address. And if there's anything that you would like to know more about as far as the world of Spirit and Shield, we kind of touched on a few things in this story. So there's, of course, Cambria. Alanekia, plays a major part as well. And we see our first taste of some type of magic, as well as some creatures that live in this world. So if any of that interested you and you'd like to find out more, please let me know. I am still writing these stories, of course, so if there's something you are more interested in. Oh, we also had the Optarian Falconer. The Optari are pretty cool. I can't wait to write a story about them. But yeah, so anything that you found interesting, let me know, and I will try to either work it into a story or maybe into some additional content for you. So again, thank you very much for listening, watching, and for more updates, follow me on social media. Links are down below. And until next time, take care.